Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the America's Founding Series, a special feature of the P.A.S. Report podcast. And I'm glad you could join me today. Make sure you are following and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Most importantly, share this episode with your family and friends, and make sure that you leave a comment on either Apple Podcast or Spotify. Give the PAS Report a 5-star rating. And I want to hear what you think about the America's Founding series, because I believe it's so important that we begin to re-examine our past, look at the founding of this country, and recognize the forgotten patriots that have really shaped such an exceptional nation. These people played an active role, whether they knew it or not, in America's founding, and it's important that they get their due. They deserve the recognition. Maybe if Americans had a better sense of our past, of our founding, and the special role that all these different people played, maybe we'd have a better appreciation for the country that we're living in. Maybe we'd get back to the roots of what America was all about, the ideas of liberty and freedom, the concept of limited government, the concept of self-reliance, that you are in charge of your own destiny, that we all play our role within this system, and we may not realize it, but we all have a sense of purpose. And that's what I want to focus on in today's episode, because I have a great forgotten patriot that has long been ignored. He wasn't ignored at the time. He received his due. But shortly after the American Revolution, he just vanished in the annals of history. And so last week I brought up Filippo Mazzi. I had to start with an Italian guy because I come from an Italian background. So that was that one. But today I'm going to bring you the story of another forgotten patriot, the man who became the first casualty of the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks. And his name is remembered to a certain degree, but do we really know who he was? Was he a hero, a rebel, or just an ordinary man caught in the chaos of history? And what can his story tell us today? What can we learn from his story? When we look, Boston, obviously the tensions are rising. The air is thick with anger. People are tired of British rule. And you have British soldiers that walk among the people wearing their red coats. And it's a glaring reminder of who is really in charge, and that the colonies are not free. That ultimately it's King George. In the middle of the increasing chaos, the storm that's forming, is a man named Crispus Attucks. Now, some of you may have heard of him, many have not, but Attucks represents why history can be so difficult at times, because Attucks lived a life that history has struggled to fully uncover. We don't have tons of information about him. He was not a wealthy landowner. He was not some famous statesman that existed. He was a laborer, a sailor, and a former slave. By many accounts, he was a man who understood struggle firsthand. He was of mixed race heritage, African and Native American, and we don't know the exact tribe. There are some suggestions that he was from a Wampanoag tribe. He was a man who had no voice in the system, yet he found himself at the heart of one of the most important moments in American history. And that's one of the aspects that makes his story so remarkable. You know, some believe that he was an escaped slave, but the records are actually unclear about that. The only evidence that we have to support the idea that he was a runaway slave was an advertisement in the Boston Gazette from 1750. You had William Brown of Framingham, Massachusetts, place an advertisement in the Boston Gazette offering a reward for the return of a runaway enslaved person named Crispus. Now, he was described in this ad as a 27-year-old, 6'2" mulatto, mixed race, with short curly hair. So we have no way of knowing if this is the same Crispus, but it matches the time frame, and the physical description matches what we know of Attucks. What we do know for sure is that for over a decade, he worked as a sailor and dock worker, moving between Boston and the surrounding ports in the area. And in those days, when we look at Boston, it was a powder keg. I mean, you had tensions rising. The British troops had been sent in to keep order, but instead it just antagonized the situation. They became symbols of the occupation. The economy was struggling. People were finding it difficult to make a living. And British soldiers and laborers were constantly at each other's throats. It was a breaking point. We saw it in the taverns back then. We saw it in the streets. People spoke about rebellion. And on the night of March 5th, 1770, Crispus Attucks found himself at the center of it all. What was he doing there? Well, some say he led the crowd. Others say he was just passing through. What we do know is that he stood at the steps of history. He stood in front of the group as colonists confronted British soldiers outside the custom house. Insults were being thrown, objects were being hurled at the British soldiers, and then gunfire rang out. Attucks was the first to fall, struck in the chest by British bullets. And he never knew that his death would be remembered as the spark of an American Revolution. He had no idea. In the days that followed, colonial leaders seized the moment. You had Paul Revere create his famous engraving of the Boston Massacre depicting the soldiers as ruthless executioners, and the colonists as defenseless victims like Crispus Attucks. But history is more complicated. In truth, the event was chaotic. Both sides were on edge, and I don't think anyone knows for sure who fired the first shot. Even John Adams, the future president of the United States, one of our most revered founding fathers, would later defend the British soldiers in court, arguing that they were acting in self-defense. But it doesn't matter because the damage was already done. History was already being made, and the massacre became a rallying cry. Crispus Attucks became the symbol of liberty and freedom. Crispus Attucks being the first victim of the Boston Massacre, being the first victim of the American Revolution. You know, Crispus Attucks, once he was shot and killed, he never saw what would come next. He never saw the Boston Tea Party, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, the Paris Accord. But his death had meaning. And in death, he became a larger-than-life figure, a martyr for liberty, even as he lived in a world that actually denied him the full benefits. The irony cannot be ignored. We have to discuss the irony, the uncomfortable truths that exist. And one of the first to die for the American cause, American freedom, was a man, in many ways, who never got to experience freedom. Reports have it that Attucks was African Native American descent, as I said last segment, and some accounts suggest that his parents were Prince Younger, and he was an enslaved man from Africa, and Nancy Attucks, a Native American woman. But at the time, he was not seen as equal in the eyes of the law. Yet he was the first to spill his blood for the idea of liberty. And his story reminds us that history is not as simple as heroes and villains that so many make it out to be. You know, too often history is oversimplified, especially in this day and age. We have lost sight of how complicated history can be. And we try and make it as if every issue, every aspect of history is black and white. The reality is there's an enormous gray area that history operates in. It's similar to policy, right? We always talk about policy as if it's a binary option, black and white choices. No. There's this gray area that we have to operate in, but too often we ignore the gray area because we fail to think critically anymore. History is often about people, ordinary folks like you and I, who get thrown into extraordinary circumstances, and how we handle those circumstances is what ultimately gets recorded. Now, I want everyone to think back to 9/11 and all the stories of just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Do you think that all those people that perished on 9/11, do you think they woke up that morning with the intent on becoming heroes? History doesn't ask us. And before Crispus Attucks' legacy was fully cemented, we have to look at the trial that took place. And it was a trial. It tells us a great deal of how history is shaped. John Adams, the future president of the United States, was the lawyer who defended the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. It was a bold move, and it nearly destroyed his career. But Adams believed that law and justice had to prevail, no matter how unpopular his defense might be. He argued that the soldiers acted in self-defense, that the crowd was too aggressive, that the crowd was inciting violence, that men like Attucks was responsible for the chaos, and in the end, most of the soldiers were actually acquitted in Boston. It's fascinating to think about how different perspectives shape our understanding of history. In that courtroom, Crispus Attucks was painted as a reckless agitator, someone who had stirred the mob into violence. But in the court of public opinion, he was a martyr for the cause of liberty, standing up to tyranny. And so which version of history is true? And the answer is complex, because history itself is complex. The reality is that Attucks was a working man, ordinary guy, frustrated with British rule, part of a city that was boiling over. He was one of the many who were fed up. They were tired of the abuses. He felt powerless. And in that moment on King Street, he made a choice to take a stand. He wanted to stand in defiance to British rule. And how did the world remember him? How did his legacy evolve over time? Initially, his name was not universally celebrated. It was celebrated during the Revolution. It was used to inspire the masses. However, after the Revolution, many of the founding figures of the new nation, men who had been quick to use Crispus Attucks as a piece of propaganda from the Boston Massacre, they didn't continue to celebrate Attucks' role in history. He was not included in the pantheon of early American heroes. And why is that? Part of the reason is because the new republic was struggling. You know, we were deeply entangled with the contradictions of slavery. But Attucks' story tells us much more, and Attucks' story would not disappear. His memory was revived by abolitionists in the 19th century, who saw him as a symbol against oppression. You had people like Frederick Douglass and other abolitionist leaders invoking his name, reminding Americans that the fight for freedom had always been diverse, that men of all races had sacrificed for the cause. Later, during the Civil Rights Movement, we saw Attucks' name again become even more prominent. But here's what makes his story even more powerful. Attucks wasn't a military general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a wealthy merchant funding a revolution. He was a common laborer, an everyday man who found himself in a moment that would change the world. He didn't know that his death would be written into the story of American independence, but it was. And that's where the deeper lesson of this episode comes from. History is filled with moments where ordinary people change the course of events, and they don't realize it at the time. Attucks had no idea that he would be remembered centuries later, and I wonder if he knew that he was going to get shot and killed on that night. Would he have stood in front of the crowd? Was this his fate? Was it his destiny? Was it America's destiny? Who knows? But the fact does remain. He is the first casualty of the American Revolution, and he deserves to be celebrated and recognized for that. Too often we think that history is shaped by only the powerful, right? By kings and presidents and military leaders. But that's not true. History is built by the people whose names that we don't remember. It's shaped by the choices made in moments that at the time may seem insignificant. A dock worker standing in the streets of Boston could not have known that he would be remembered centuries later, and he would be part of a movement that reshaped the entire world. But he was. And in that, the important truth for all of us, the truth that we all need to hear. You don't have to be famous, powerful, or wealthy to make an impact. You don't have to know exactly where you're going or what you're doing to have purpose. Sometimes our greatest contributions to history, our most important acts, are ones we never see the full results of. We live in a time when so many young Americans feel lost. They wonder if their lives have meaning, if their voices matter, if they have purpose. The answer is yes, because history is not made by the people that society deems important. It's made by people like Crispus Attucks. It's made by people that are just living their ordinary lives, waking up in the mornings, going to work, taking care of their families, raising their children. People who, through small acts of courage, shape the world in so many ways that they and we never fully understand. So if you take one thing away from this episode, let it be this. You have purpose. Your actions matter. And just like Crispus Attucks, even if the world doesn't always recognize it, what you do today can echo for generations to come. It's something that all Americans, young and old, should recognize. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's always how we grow the audience here. It's how the podcast gets discovered by others. Make sure to take 30 seconds and actually write a review as well. And next week, I'm going to have another great patriot that we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to reveal the name now. I always keep that a secret until the day of. But it's going to be someone that you're going to find fascinating, someone that played an integral role in the creation of the United States of America. So make sure you keep it tuned in here to the P.A.S. report, the America's Founding series. I got great episodes lined up for next week that you're not going to want to miss. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.